Thanks for joining in the latest of the Sydney Institute's virtual meetings and discussion time at a time of pandemic. And so today Barbara Heineback makes a welcome first appearance at the Sydney Institute. She'll be well known to many of you for her occasional appearances on television, but I should introduce her, I suppose, as the press officer to the First Lady Rosalind Carter during the Carter administration, and she's been a consultant and advisor for various Democratic Party administrations and for Democratic and Republican politicians. And the topic today is the United States after the death of George Floyd, overflowing anger versus voices of hope. Barbara, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me today, and thank you, Jared, thank you, Anne, and the Sydney Institute. Before we get started, I have a question and a request. Number one, my question. Have you ever needed to call the police when you were either needing some protection or you really felt like you were in serious danger? Scared for your life? Think about that through this discussion. And also I ask that you consider what would life be like without police. Honestly, try to imagine how comfortable would that make you feel. Now my topic, as Jared has said, is overflowing anger versus voices of hope. Black Lives Matter, let's start there. We're going to talk about Black Lives Matter in an abbreviated perspective, George Floyd, the domestic and its global impact, similarities and dissimilarities between these marches and demonstrations that we see now this year in 2020 as opposed to those in 1968. I'd really like to spend some time talking about victims. I really feel that we must all do our part. Each of us has to make a contribution when you want to bring about a viable change. With time permitting, American leadership, the political leadership as well as beyond the political. In other words, the leaders of America, where are they today? The voices have been very quiet. Media madness, and also a bit about the coming election. Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter began by the killing of Eric Garner, a black man by the hands of a policeman's chokehold in New York City, July 2013. Black Lives Matter was ignited, and it began by 3 black women. They started this group and they called it Social Justice, and it was made up of anti-fascists and arguably a Marxist organization. Also, July 2013. Today they have about 40 chapters, domestically and internationally. And almost a month ago now, when George Floyd was killed at the hands of a policeman's chokehold, it created a rise throughout America. It created a rise of people that started to demonstrate, not like we demonstrated in 1968, but a demonstration that came because everyone was beginning to say, enough is enough. There were marches around the world at phenomenal proportions. And the best part about this, most of the marches that happened outside of the United States have been very peaceful, thank heaven for that. And some of the marches in the United States, we've had serious problems with looting, robbing, and other things that have been more of a distractor than a help. So when you're trying to bring about change, does it help when you have so many distractors in the mix, or you are voicing anger without some inclusion of what is it that you really want to see changed and what you want to happen? Our so-called American leadership, they're MIA. Where have they gone? From the White House to the Congress to the Senate to our other leaders, blacks and whites, people have become very quiet And is that not because no one really knows what to do about this, because it's very sad that so much has gotten out of hand so egregiously over the last couple of decades that it's just mushroomed into something that now no one knows quite how to handle. I do truly believe that the brutality that was cast on George Floyd is inexcusable. Thank heaven we have it on camera. And for those who felt for a while that, oh, some people just have a chip on their shoulders and it's just their problem, no, it's quite clear. And people have known, I think, for many years that there's been a very one-sided case of the overwhelming brutality of policemen against black men and other men of color. Some of my first big applaud to Black Lives Matter is that they created a movement that, because they've tried to bring attention to the police brutality, it has gone global, and they've had wonderful people marching with them across the nation and around the world. And that is a big plus, and I give Black Lives credit for that. Some of my concerns of Black Lives Matter is that the focus now, after almost a month of marching, we are yet to hear, what is it you want? We have heard from some of the mayors in cities talk about defunding the police, dismantling the policemen altogether. Does that make sense? What do they plan to replace it with? Question. Isn't it interesting that one of the first things these mayors in these cities started talking about is grabbing the money? And all of a sudden we're talking about defunding the police, moving the money into some rather obscure community organizations and maybe a little training for the police and this and that. But there's no clear direction, and no one is being clear about where the money is going to go. They know they want to snatch it from the police departments. We see a lot of policemen today who are leaving the service, or they're just not showing up for work. If you look at a place like, for example, Seattle, Washington, they started to take over a part of Capitol Hill. Seattle is the capital of Washington State on the West Coast, above California, Oregon, Washington State, not the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. In Seattle, they started a group called, they took over a portion of the city of Capitol Hill. They call it CHAZ, C-H-A-Z, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. They renamed part of that the other day. Now it's CHOP, Capitol Hill, what is it? CHOP stands for Capitol Hill Occupied Protests, whatever that means. You have shops there and people working there and living close by, and if they are interviewed and asked, how do you feel about Black Lives Matter and this takeover, they either say nothing in front of the camera, or they feel forced to say, well, it's all right. They're scared to death that their shops are going to be broken into if they don't. And one lady said this morning, well, it would have been last night in the States, when she called the police 18 times and there's been no response. The police are not going into this area. They have a woman who's the mayor of Seattle, and the governor both said that they believe they can handle this peacefully without the president getting involved or trying to send in military or the National Guard. How is that going to work out? If they get away with it, how many more cities are going to try to take over portions of maybe their capital cities or just anywhere within the state? I have concerns. I think Black Lives started the movement, they made their demonstrations, and they had a wonderful opportunity when the eyes of the world were upon them to say something constructive about what their direction would be, what they might have wanted, and where they were going to take the movement going forward. More important than, it's not just the issues of police brutality, But what about all the other injustices that we should be fighting for and were talking about some 20 and 30 years ago? I'm talking about things like this, the real social justice or injustice that Black Lives Matter say they stand for. But should that not include the inequality of opportunities in the workplace? What about job access? Getting the door open for the interview. There are many people who are qualified, people of color, and if a company or an organization knows that they don't look vanilla enough, can they even make it to the interview? Can they get a shot at a better job or a better opportunity? Inequality in schools, everything from school books to great teachers and to opportunities there. I have a house in a part of Maryland, and even though my son is a grown man now, I walked over to one of the local primary schools and I was going to volunteer half a day. During the week, I felt I wanted to give something back and be engaged in my community. And I asked the primary school, I said, I've come in and I'd like to volunteer half a day, and is there anything I can do? And they looked at me and they said one word, no, we don't need any help. This was an underserved school that had youngsters there, and there were some concerns. There was a lot of need, obviously, for people to come in and do something constructive. But sometimes when people are just skating and getting by, and they don't want anyone looking or noticing or meddling in what it is they're about, they are very happy to just let the students who don't want to learn stay in the back of the classrooms, play on their phones, play games, and they might teach a few of the students who are interested or just hand them something to read and work with, because we have too many teachers who are there for the paycheck and looking forward to a retirement day. Now, I'm not talking about some of the wonderful teachers in the world, especially those in inner cities who have to really struggle that much more to make a difference, to prove themselves, and to be willing to work with some of these underserved students to try to help them get a better shot and better opportunities in the world. Also, the inequality of job promotions. You get a job and you are in the house or in the organization, but then are you going to be allowed any advancement? Can you make it through the glass ceiling if you're a woman? Can you make it to the C-level positions if you're a man or a woman of color or coming from an underserved community? And then what we've seen through COVID-19 so much recently is that it has hit the inner cities and people of color far more than it has the other populations. More black deaths in the black communities in New York City, in cities in the South, in Texas, Louisiana, places like that, where they were heavily hit for a while. This is not a surprise. It's one of those issues that gets raised just before an election day, and then both the Democrats and the Republicans pretend to care, but it becomes very quiet after election day, and not much is done about it. Why do I believe there's a big difference from the marches in 1968 and the marches and demonstrations that we're seeing today in 2020? At least in 1968, I was a student at Howard University, Washington, D.C. We marched. Stokely Carmichael was coming on campus numerous times with the Black Power arm and talking about improvements in certain things. More to the point, it was those marches began after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy was John F. Kennedy's, the president's brother. And those two assassinations caused the marches of Washington, D.C. What happened there? 7th Street corridor was destroyed, and the shops along there by the demonstrators. And many of those shops were owned by people of color. so that even though Washington, D.C. got rebuilt after the looting and the destruction of some of the people that marched along in 1968, Washington, D.C. downtown got repaired very quickly, and some of the other outlying communities. But that 7th Street corridor, I moved abroad overseas for some years, came back, and many of those same shops on 7th Street were still boarded up and didn't get rebuilt, because it's the people of those shops that are owned by people of color, and those communities tend to be the worst hit by these demonstrations, and they're the last to be rebuilt, they're the slowest to be rebuilt, and some of them do not get rebuilt, so people have lost a livelihood and a job and an opportunity. We also marched in '68 for a purpose. We knew we wanted voter rights, we wanted more opportunities in the job market, and we were asking for health care, and we had a lot of concern about schools and busing and very specific guidelines of what we wanted changed. So this is my concern, that I marched with Black Lives Matter. It started in 2013, early 2015, I marched in Maryland with them one night. It was a fairly new organization. I wanted to see what it was about. And I marched with them from the harbor all the way up to the state capitol building in Annapolis. When we got to the state capitol building, there was a monument, a statue there, and some of the men in that march wanted to tear the statue down. I went over and talked to them, calmed them down a little bit. It didn't get torn down that day. It did come down a couple of weeks later. I was very glad it did. Another concern I have with Black Lives Matter is, if you are going to bring about a positive change, here we are not even a month since the death of Floyd. Why is it that people are trying to go after the money, and why are we focused on so many statues? These statues have been there for hundreds of years. Some, not hundreds of, well, yeah, they have actually for a couple of centuries or 150 years. It's not going to change the lifestyle or make any improvements in these communities of color if that statue stays up another few months, or if it comes down immediately. Should that be on the A list? Let's ask, is this media driven, or what is driving the attention to statues rather than to the major concerns of social issues that I thought this organization was standing for? I worry about when I see these statues. Do I think they should be destroyed, plummeted into the river? No, it's part of the history. And when you look at the history, I think it was Condoleezza Rice who said a few years ago, you do not want to obliterate the history or make it become invisible. And she has a point there, I believe, and others have said it. There's a place, whether you want to put them in a museum, move them somewhere else, but if you're going to have a plaque under some of these heroes or so-called heroes, some of them have done some wonderful things for their country. We've had an issue here right in Sydney where they were taking down or trying to take down Cook's statue just a week ago. What were the positive contributions he made? What were the problems we have with him? Where was he unfair? If he was brutal, and if he was a slave owner, whatever the real story is, let's give some balance and tell both sides. They always say if you don't know your history, history is certain to repeat itself. So we have to look at some of these issues. This past weekend with Chaz, with CHOP in Seattle, should be enough cause to make us wonder, is it not time for these demonstrations to cease? My big concern is the language of Black Lives Matter seems to make everyone feel as though if you're black, you're a victim. That's not true. And when you know your history, you don't feel like a victim. And if someone is trying to treat you as a second-class citizen, when you know your history, I think you have a little more wherewithal to stand up for yourself and put that person in check and say, wait a minute, I can quote you chapters of what I've had to do to not have a door shut when I was offered a job and then they tried to take it back. It was my job at the White House. I was offered a job and then once hired, they tried to push me over into the corner. And I said, I'm not going to be a wallflower. I didn't come here for window dressing. So you need to know how to stand up. When my son was in school, he was offered an opportunity. He wasn't offered the opportunity. He had to take a test to get into a certain seminar program for the achieving students. He made the cut. He did well on the exam. I would never have heard about it had I not gotten a call from a teacher, so we can talk about that later. But we have to parent, we have to take self-responsibility, and there's a book called They Came Before the Mayflower, and that's a book about Africans who were in America not as slaves, but they came as some of the first founders of America early on. When my parents took us to Williamsburg as a child, I remember every statue I saw, all of the images and all of the conversation. It was, you know, Thomas Jefferson, Washington, etc. But there were no blacks having anything to do with the history. And if you saw a Native American Indian, it was a Native American with a feather in his cap, but nothing said about the contribution of how they taught some of the white settlers, European settlers, what to do with corn. And if you don't know your history, it's very similar when we think of Booker T. Washington and all of the things that he did with the peanut. So we have to all take some responsibility, recognize some of our heroes, some of the scientists and people in every walk of life. And when times get tough, you don't quit, but you work harder rather than just collapsing and saying, well, I'm a victim and they don't like me or they don't want me to have an opportunity. Maybe they don't, but that doesn't mean you stop just because you don't have someone welcoming you with open arms. Let's look at leadership. What's been going on for the last month among our American leadership? The president's been very quiet. I don't think he knows what to do about this at all. And whereas he might have called out the military much sooner, he realized from others around him and also from what he's looking at on television that if he does this, then things are probably just going to escalate that much more. His walk over to St. John's Church was a big mistake, and I'm still surprised that his press corps didn't work that out a little more and arrange, at least say something about St. John's being burnt the night before, and the nursery downstairs was still burning or smoldering at least, and he stood there and held the Bible. He's not a regular attendee of St. John's Church. I think every president in recent history has attended that church a couple of times, regardless of their faith, but this was just inappropriate. When we saw the Democrats and Nancy Pelosi and others, about 12 of them, they finally came up from wherever they were hiding, and they all had on the Ghanaian kinka cloth around their necks and tried to make some pronouncement of caring, but what have they done? I hope, Jared, when you and I talk in a few minutes, that we can talk about some of these individual inner cities, who's running them, and it's not always just the white on black crime, it's just as often black on black crime. Don't hear the media talking about that. But if we're really going to make any forward movement in these areas of correcting social change and making a difference, we've got to bring up some pretty uncomfortable issues, I'm afraid, and not just be politically correct, but talk about what can and needs to be done and have a little honesty, because it's going to take both sides making some adjustments and changes if you want, I believe, a better and an improved outcome in this. So those are my opening statements and comments, and if we can chat now more specifically about issues, I'd be happy to. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, many thanks to Barbara Heineback for a stimulating introduction. And now we'll go and do some questions and discussion. And thanks to our members who've sent in some questions and points for discussion today. Barbara, thanks for that today.
Thank you.
Very, very stimulating, very interesting. Towards the end of your talk, you spoke a bit about some of the big American cities. I think it's fair to say that if you're an Australian watching mainstream Australian television, you would get the impression that somehow the Republican administration, and in particular President Trump, is largely or substantially responsible. But as you well know, most of the cities in which there have been the major disturbances have Democratic governors and get Democratic mayors. So how do you see the problems that have emerged in these large American cities where the Republicans don't have much control over?
If we're honest about it, when we look at Chicago and other cities, Chicago, Atlanta, San Francisco, that are sliding backward in terms of the social discourse, these cities have dilapidated. San Francisco, still quite a beautiful city, yes, but it has its areas that have become so dilapidated that it's not at all the same city when I lived there in, what was it, the early 90s. And right now, we have women that are women mayors, who is the mayor of San Francisco, the mayor of Chicago, the mayor of Atlanta. Atlanta and Chicago, you have Black American women who are the mayors. LA is a Latino man who is the mayor. San Francisco, there's a woman of color who's the mayor. These cities have more problems now. Homeless numbers have gone up exponentially in LA and San Francisco. The killings in Chicago have been, I think it was 30 or 40 some over Memorial Day weekend who were shot in Chicago alone, and about 18 died. These cities have been run by Democrats for the last 30 or 40 years. You have people like Maxine Waters in LA. She's been talking about, from before Donald Trump even got in the White House, impeach 45. He did get impeached, as we know, by the Congress, but everybody knew that wasn't going to, make any difference, because the Senate would never impeach him, and even if they had tried, impeach him on what? So whereas the mainstream media would like for the world to believe that Donald Trump is the cause somehow of Black Americans not having any equal opportunities, or they're not being well served, if we're honest about it and you look at the facts, Donald Trump has improved the economy of the nation very drastically until COVID-19. Black unemployment has never been as low, and Black employment was never as high until COVID-19 came, until Donald Trump came in. Donald Trump is the first white Republican, not president, but when he was still a candidate, who actually went into some of the inner cities where the majority of the population, or where it had a very high population of Black people living there, and he actually campaigned and asked for their vote. Other Republican men haven't even bothered to do that. And trade and some other things. So, and he also made some legislation that will now allow for funds to go to some of the historically Black colleges and universities in America. That's something that presidents have talked about for the last 3 or 4 administrations, Donald Trump is the first one who actually made it happen, and he did something about
I
it.
think in the campaign he famously said to an audience of black Americans, give me a go, your plight can't be any worse, or words to that effect. And
He said, what have you got to lose?
What have you got
That
to
was
lose,
his slogan, yes.
And in a sense that was correct, and as you know, his black vote was higher than Mitt Romney's black vote was.
Yeah. Or any other
4 years
Republican.
earlier, or any other Republican. Just go back for a fraction to what you said about San Francisco. I mean, that's Nancy Pelosi's home territory, isn't it?
Nancy Pelosi's territory and Dianne Feinstein. Now, I've been to Dianne Feinstein's home for lunch a couple of times, and, in a cocktail party there once. These ladies live in gated communities, and it's easy for them to say, and I'm talking about maybe 20 years ago when I lived there, about 30, 20, 1990s, and so they talk a good line. They're Democrats, and they say that they're for the underserved, but when you look at what they've done, it hasn't been much. It hasn't been much at all. Maxine Waters down in LA area, she comes in, she gets the vote. She's been a legislator now in Congress for some 30 years. She doesn't live in the community that votes her in time and time again. She has her driver, and these drivers, I believe they all carry guns, and she too lives behind a gated community. Dianne Feinstein is not in a gated community as such, but there's a policeman down at the end of the road by the cul-de-sac where she lives, and this was 30 years ago when there were very few issues at all. And I'm talking about so many of the politicians, whether they, just because they're Democrats, regardless of what the color of their skin is, if you haven't done anything for me over these last 3 or 4 decades, Donald has a point. What have you got to lose?
No, I'm not an expert on incarceration in the United States. As you know, it's high in the black community, but as I understand it, President Trump tried to get some reforms there, I think in the federal system, to get blacks who are in prison for long terms for what didn't seem to be all that serious crimes out. So just give us some background on that.
We have something that's been in play now called 3 strikes, you're out. And if a man is arrested because he was caught with a joint, with some marijuana or something, if that's his 3rd strike, then he can go to prison for that if it's the 3rd, time he's had a law enforcement strike against his name. So he's trying to get some of the petty stuff out of the way in order for people that are serving 4 and 5 and 10 years reduced to something that makes sense for a term, in prison or in jail. And so he's trying to make some corrections there, and for the systems in the states to begin to look at some equality. Why don't we have more organizations who are putting some meat to the bone and who are being very specific with what it is they want to see? When I was more involved in politics in the states, we had the NAACP, the Urban League, you had community leaders, and there were so many of them who were involved in their own communities, and they lived in these communities. There was talk some years ago about in the police forces that each community should have a certain percentage, a modicum of, I don't know if they ever gave it a number, 25, 30%. If it's a majority black community, then you want some people on the police force looking like the people that live in that community. And you would like to see some of the police force and law enforcement come from that area, look similar, and be very specific about what would change look like. Let's not just look at it and study it, but specifically what do we want to see changed and what will it take to have these improvements. I think we've become so, and I'm using this term a lot lately because I believe it, the political correctness nonsense, I think we ought to just toss that out the window. And if these marches have taught us nothing else, maybe that is one of the things. Let's make a list of these are the things that you guys are doing that bother me. And then I want to hear from you guys, these are the things that the other side is doing that's bothering them. And we all have to agree to make some changes. I can't dump it all on you. And even if the other person has been more in the wrong, it's not a 60-40 game. It's like, can we all come and agree that we want to make some improvements? You have to have some self-will, and you have to take some self-responsibility.
Well, those organisations you talked about there, for the most part they had leaders who, even in Australia, we knew who some of these leaders were. They appeared on television here. Mm-hmm. From your description of Black Lives Matter, essentially it doesn't seem to have any clear leadership. I mean, I wouldn't know. And the same with who it was, and the same with the left-wing organisation, essentially not only but a white organisation, Antifa. That doesn't seem to have any leaders either. So
it has no leaders, and I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
But it's very well organized,
Yes.
because they come in with these hidden brick. And I saw that time and time again over this last month, that they come in and they march during the day and they look very nice, they blend in with the rest of the people, and as soon as the sun goes down, they take off their little costumes and you see the black hoodies, and then all of a sudden these rails come down and they bring in this massive covered up bricks, and 50 guys and gals run in and they start taking the bricks and throwing them into the shop windows and wherever they are. And by then they've gotten right down to the heart of, was it Santa Cruz, California, where they were robbing everything from Rolex to...
So what, in Antifa, the black percentage would be what?
I don't know what the percentage is, but it's small.
Yeah, it's small.
It's comparatively small,
Yeah.
and they worm their way in through Black Lives Matter. And
Yes.
some of the Black Lives Matter people that are part of that organization are destructive as well.
So you've got a combination of destructive forces in Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and as you pointed out earlier, by and large they're attacking for the most part the homes of the less privileged Americans.
The less privileged Americans, and they're thieves and thugs, and they've made very little contribution to society.
Well, the most successful in political sense, as you know, of American blacks is President Obama. So how do you think he's responded to this? We haven't heard that much from him either, I think.
Yeah, we haven't. I'll tell you where I sit on Obama right now. We haven't heard much about him as far as this huge issue is concerned. He did write an essay. I read that about 2.5 weeks ago. It was okay. And he did it, from his home. And he also had, I think, a town hall meeting from his home office. And he made some comments. And there is an organization that he's involved in now. And he felt like it's some Congress, and that Congress has been around for a pretty long time, but that's a group that he's working through and within, and I know he's trying to do a lot with youth domestically and internationally. Obama's not the president right now. It's not his responsibility, and with it being such a hot potato, I'm sure that he's happy he's not the president right now. So I'm going to give him a pass on that, because this is on Donald Trump's desk right now. He's the commander-in-chief. My big problem with Obama, and I voted for him twice, and I campaigned for him a lot before I left the country, hoping that he would be the first, not hoping he'd be the first black president, yes indeed that too, but hoping he would make it to the presidency, because I really felt that he was the man and he was what the country needed at the time. My concern with Barack Obama is he came to Washington from Chicago. He cut his teeth politically on being a community leader and helping the underserved, and he was going to do so much. Why is it that when he went back to, not went back, but he's still in Washington, D.C., living in a $9.5 million house, I might add, didn't make that much money as president, it's $400,000 a year. And he sold some books, yes, but not that many. Never mind that. My big concern is, why hasn't he said anything about Chicago? Why hasn't he said anything about the South Side? Who was Obama's chief of staff? Rahm Emanuel, during his first term, for about a year and a half or two. Rahm Emanuel jumped ship, left the White House, went back to Chicago because he saw a chance to be mayor there. He was mayor for 2 terms, Ron was, while Barack was still president. He did nothing for the South Side or trying to stop the crime. And he had all, I can't say all the power in the world, but he more than anyone had the opportunity. He was in authority, and he could have called on his old buddy Barack Obama, and together they could have made Chicago, put it right up on a pedestal and said, this is what you do to stop crime, this is how we garner our youth, this is how we make some improvements through community awareness and improvements. He will not touch that, nor will the media touch anything about all of the problems that are going on in these urban and inner cities today. I would love to have a column or a byline or something in one of the papers to start to break down what some of the real issues are that people don't understand. Sanctuary cities, border control, some of the other issues of it's going to be, I believe, the demise and dilapidation of cities if something soon is not done to put this in check and make some corrections before it's too late. Because we are moving toward anarchy, and that is, I don't like to think about that because I like to sleep well at night. And when you really think about how long is this going to go on and how long are you going to allow it to deteriorate before you put things in check, it's starting to feel quite uncomfortable.
Now, as you know, this non-reporting of places like Chicago and other democratic-controlled
Detroit,
cities,
Baltimore, just less than an hour's drive north of D.C., Minneapolis, where George Floyd was killed.
Yeah. So what you're dealing with here, not overwhelmingly, but largely a white media not reporting this. I mean, this is not the blacks who aren't reporting. A lot of the blacks are speaking out about it.
The networks are owned by, white Americans, wealthy white Americans, absolutely.
So what's their problem? Do they have a guilt problem? I mean, why won't they report what
No, it's not a guilt problem. They don't like Donald Trump. Anyone except Trump. And this is, what do they call CBS, the Clinton Bureau of News or something like that. But your networks and the Democratic Party are, there's a marriage there.
Now I want to get on some personal matters in a minute, but before we do, you started off talking about 1968 and they're essentially in Chicago, they were elsewhere, but they were mainly outside the Democratic Convention in Chicago, and as you know, it was in the lead up to the 68 election, and as you know, President Nixon, as he became, had a massive victory over Herbert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, who had some standing as the incumbent vice president at the time, although Nixon had also been a vice president. But the reaction to those riots seemed to give Nixon many, many more votes than he otherwise would have got. Now I know we're some months out, and it's always dangerous to make predictions about the future, as they say, but is this going to work for Trump, or is it not going to work for Trump? Or
I was waiting for that question.
Or is it too early to say?
Yes, it's too early to say, especially now, COVID-19 and the way the tweets have had one audience and mainstream media another. I wouldn't put 25 cents toward which way it's going to go this early. But will that work for Trump? Possibly. I think he's got to be thinking about that and considering that, hoping that that's the case. How long are you going to let it go on, and how do you stop it? Because there's very strong feelings about, we don't want the media to get involved, the military to get involved, but the National Guard is another thing, and there are plenty of them. So we'll see. I think what we're looking at in Seattle is going to be a real test, and if it starts to mushroom, and if we start to see other takeovers in other states, other capitals, other large city communities. Something soon is going to have to.
But the mayor, I shouldn't laugh at this, but the mayor of Seattle said this could be a period of love, a year of love, I think she said.
I asked myself, what rock is she living under when I heard that comment? I don't think I can dignify that with anything.
But anarchy is always difficult, as we know from European history, from American history. Anarchy is always very difficult to control. I mean, it's not easy, but I suppose someone has to do it. Tell us about yourself. I mean, you grew up in the United States. I think you grew up in New York, but your parents came from Georgia and Florida. Did you experience much discrimination for yourself or your children?
No, I didn't experience discrimination as a young girl. Growing up, I don't think my brother did either. We went first Catholic school and then to public schools. We were by large in the minority, and for some years the only children of color in our schools. So there's no point in discriminating against us. We were just a little, bleep on the screen. We were just neighbors and students and community members. There were a few instances I recall when my son was in high school in La Jolla, California, very nice community just north of San Diego, in Southern California. And one instance when he was in high school, I came home from work one afternoon, and my son would have been in the 10th grade, I think 9th or 10th, and the school had about 1,500, 1,600 students. Maybe there were 24 students of color in the school. A number of the other youngsters of color were bussed into the community. We lived a couple of blocks. We lived just around the corner, really up the hill. And so one afternoon I come home from work. My son tells me he was harassed by a policeman that afternoon. So what happened? And he said that he was standing outside talking to two classmates, and they were in the car, and a policeman came by and stopped and said, "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" And he looked and he said, "I live right there." He went upstairs. And so he shushed my son off and everything. Well, I was at school the next morning when the principal got there. I went into his office and I shared with him that I wanted a policeman to come up. And he said, "You want an apology for your son?" I said, "That's not what I'm asking. I want a policeman to come up, and I want him to meet not just with my son, but with every young black man who's attending high school here, and to have a conversation with them, what their rights are, what they're not, what they can ask, what they can do." And I'd like that to happen in fast order, and it did happen about a week and a half later. I had a friend, I remembered she dated a detective, and she helped me get the right person who would go up and speak to these young men. So you try to take a positive, I think, attitude, but nip it in the bud when and where you can. There was another incident that happened maybe a year or so later, and my son he had to take, students who were interested could take a test to get into what they called a special seminar program. 2 classes that were going to be combined together for 2 class periods run by 2 professors, a man and a woman, and they were going to be discussing civics and this and that. If you didn't score high enough on this exam, you wouldn't be eligible for this 2-year seminar that they were going to have. My son took the exam, he passed. I did not know about this, and I got a call one evening, and one of the professors, the woman, she called and asked me, and she said, "Mrs. Heineback, can you share why you wouldn't want your son to be in this seminar?" I said, "What are you talking about?" I had no idea that this was going on, and she explained what the seminar was, etc. So the next morning I was down at school before it opened. I called work, said I'll be in late, and it was the principal. I went in and spoke to him, and he shared with me, "Oh, I don't think your son would be interested in this, and this is for students that are really going to excel and everything." And I said, "Are you telling me mine is not?" And started to make some excuses and all, and I said, "Why didn't I know about this, and why did my son not come home, with some information that he had been, oh, well, I just pulled his name, I didn't think he'd be interested. I said, are you his parent? I said, you have no right, I've signed no authority over to you for this. So, we had a little discussion about this, and I was pretty clear that I wasn't pleased with what he had done. My son did end up being in the 2-year seminar, and it worked out okay. But
when you've got issues like this, and I know a case of a British politician of colour who became very successful, Chancellor of the Exchequer, but he was also told by a teacher once he shouldn't try too hard, he should be a television repairman, but he ended up becoming a millionaire and a successful politician. But if you've got a parent like you who's going to go up to the school and argue, you're going to be in a better position than if you have a parent who doesn't feel up to going up to the school and arguing. So it's a bit to do with the family structure again, isn't it?
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right, Jared. Change starts at the home. And when I go back to this politically correctness, more people need to start looking right at the parents and say, this is a problem. Your mother should be responsible, your father, your parents should be responsible for certain things. And then it goes into the neighborhood, and then into the townships and the communities. And both sides of an issue have to just stay on top of not arguing and yelling, but what is it you want to see? What do you want? Black Lives Matter, been around 7 years. We don't know what they want, other than there's a lot of fighting and a lot of discourse and disruption.
Now we're going to finish shortly, but a couple of questions that I haven't covered that our members have sent in, I want to cover very briefly, and then I want to talk to you briefly about the Carters. So, having lived in Australia and the US, do you compare the situations at all? I mean, we've got very similar demonstrations at this stage as they have, but do you see comparisons or do you see difference?
I see some comparisons. One of the little high school story, when I told the same principal at La Jolla High School, my son was coming, I was pulling him out of class because we were moving, or he was moving, he came to Australia before I did with his dad. He was moving to Australia. Principal said to me, Barbara, don't you know that's a racist country? I said, where do you think we've been living all these years? I said, like, we haven't had our issues right here. I said, give me a break. I said, I'm willing to take my chances on this. And so that's another little sign. Yes, there are comparisons. America has its issues with blacks. America has its issues with Native Americans. Australia has its issues with Aboriginals. We can go around the globe, and it's so interesting how very few countries will escape not having a culture in their country that they have tried to subjugate to a second-class level. And if you allow yourself to think you're a victim, then you might not go up to the schools, then you might not ask for the job. Then if you get a job and they try to push you off to the corner, that's when you raise your flag and say, wait a minute, I came here to do my job, and all I'm asking for is to continue to earn my right toward accomplishment and career success, or whatever success.
So you're broadly optimistic about both nations?
I am.
Yeah.
I am, because there's enough talent in both for us both to do so well. But we've got to get back to honesty and mentioning some things that are going to make us wiggle in our chairs a little bit, but we need to get it out from under the carpets.
Now, it was quite an achievement to have such a position in the White House as you had with Rosalind Carter. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about Rosalind, and then tell us a little about President Carter.
Yeah. I was very happy that Mrs. Carter believed in me enough to bring me to the White House with her. She had 4 or 5, maybe 6 advanced people while we were on the campaign trail. And I was very, very pleased that out of us all, she selected me to come with her. Maybe it's because it gave a little bit more. Had I known what I was doing, maybe I would have just done what I needed to do and get by. That would have been it. But I wasn't very sure what it was I was doing during the campaign trail, so I did everything I was asked to do. Well, I ticked off everything. Now what else can I do? So I think it does pay to go the extra mile. And I'm happy to go the extra mile. Just tell me what it is you want me to do. I'm going to do that. and when I'm really put my teeth into it, I often give a little bit more than asked. She's fair, she is comfortable in her own skin, and I recall how what she was not initially comfortable with was talking to the press. And I started her off in small groups. I had worked for CBS News, so I catch and I get when people are camera shy or shy of the press and the media. And, you know, we did a little acting before the interviews in the beginning. And in very short order, I remember we landed somewhere, and I had, you know, given her some talking points for her arrival statement and everything. And we only had about 10 press people. Barbara, how come we only had so few press? So she was starting to get comfortable with this, you know, talking to the press and all.
He won, and then 4 years later, he's defeated, which must be devastating if you can't do your second term. So tell us a bit about the highs of his win and the lows of his defeat.
Yeah. The highs of his win, I think, was that he jumped right in. When you get to the White House, it's pretty overwhelming. He's smart and intellectual. If the president had a fault, I think he intellectualized things a little too much. He tried very hard to please everyone. And as a president taking over a major nation, that is, of course, impossible. And I think it was one of his drawbacks that he could have done more and could have been more decisive about things, but he was the great equalizer and trying to please all. When he lost the election, of course, that was that whole Middle East piece and everything, because they were released the day after he lost, the president was befuddled, and he took it, yes, as a personal loss, but he wasn't concerned, I don't think, at all as much about having lost the election and his presidency. He felt like he had let the nation down and that he should have and could have done more. There's a light at the end of every tunnel, and I don't think even to this day we've had a better president in terms of Jimmy Carter being probably one that I would sing accolades around for all of the work that he's done internationally, and as an ex-president with Habitat for Humanity, for instance, and having gone around to so many nations and worked toward being a mediator, or not work toward being the mediator, but helping countries mediate major problems. And when they had a vote or an election going on, he's managed to be one of the pillars of maintaining peace.
So you'll be voting in November?
Oh, yes.
I won't ask you how. But for now, terrific.
Well, I don't even know if we know who we're going to really be voting for yet. I think things are
You're
just
not
dynamic.
sure Mr. Biden's going to make it.
I'm not sure if Mr. Biden's going to make it, so if he does, and if he really does have a woman, we're looking at the vice president right now. I think if Biden's the one who makes it, he said it's going to be a woman, and I've seen 6 names thrown up and all that, but I said maybe.
Does he say a woman of colour, or has he just settled on a woman?
He said another woman, and I saw the list of 6 a day or 2 ago, and it had at least 2 women of color. It had Harris, it had Kamala Harris, and another woman of color. Oh, the woman from Georgia who was running for Adams. Yeah. And so, and she has no credentials at all, let alone to be president.
So when you say you're voting for the vice president, are you suggesting that if he wins,
if Biden wins,
wouldn't serve 4 years?
No. A month or 2 at best, I think.
Well, what a scoop. You heard it at the Sydney Institute. But thanks for a great presentation.
Thank you very much for having me.